Daniel Foster stood in front of the towering steel and glass facade of Greystone Industries, his breath misting in the chilly afternoon air. He adjusted the cuffs of his only good suit, willing his nerves to settle. It had been a long road to this moment, years of fighting his way back to normalcy after the war, years of battling his own demons, and months of struggling to land a job that would give him a fresh start. The mirror in his tiny apartment that morning had reflected a man who had once been a warrior, a soldier who had led men through the sands of Afghanistan, who had stared death in the face and survived. But now, that same man was forced to prove his worth to a corporate world that barely acknowledged his sacrifices. As he stepped through the heavy glass doors, the warmth of the lobby wrapped around him, a stark contrast to the cold reception he received from the receptionist behind the front desk. She was young, probably in her mid-20s, with sleek blonde hair and a sharp blazer. Her eyes flicked up from her computer, scanning him quickly, pausing on his prosthetic leg, which peeked subtly from beneath his tailored slacks. Her expression didn't change, but Daniel caught the momentary hesitation in her posture, the slight narrowing of her eyes, before she masked it with professional detachment. "Name?" she asked without looking at him again. "Daniel Foster. I have an interview with Mr. Kessler at 2 o'clock. A short pause. She picked up the phone, whispered something, then nodded toward the elevators. "5th floor," she said. "Down the hall, second door on the right." Daniel thanked her and walked toward the elevator, forcing himself to ignore the pit of anxiety growing in his stomach. He had done this before, interviewed, pitched himself, sat across from men in suits who had never seen a battlefield, never lost friends to IEDs, never spent sleepless nights wrestling with the ghosts of war. He pressed the button, inhaled deeply, and stepped inside. The doors slid open on the 5th floor, revealing a sleek, modern office space with glass-walled rooms and leather furniture. Daniel walked down the hallway, each step of his prosthetic making a soft clink against the tiled floor. He ignored the few glances from employees, the quick whispers before they returned to their screens. When he entered Richard Kessler's office, the man was already seated behind a massive mahogany desk, skimming through Daniel's resume. He was in his mid-40s, with perfectly styled dark hair and a sharp navy suit that probably cost more than Daniel's rent. He barely looked up as Daniel stepped forward. "Mr. Foster," Kessler said, finally standing and offering his hand. It was a weak handshake, brief and disinterested. "Please, have a seat." Daniel sat, watching as Kessler continued scanning the paper in front of him. A deep silence stretched between them before Kessler sighed and leaned back in his chair. "So, you're a veteran," he said, as if it were a flaw rather than a qualification. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Yes, sir. U.S. Army, 101st Airborne Division, 2 tours in Afghanistan. I specialized in risk assessment, crisis response, and security operations." Kessler nodded absently, flipping the resume page like it was a formality rather than an opportunity. "And your injury?" he asked, barely glancing up. Daniel had answered this question before, many times, but it never stopped stinging. "Lost my leg in an IED blast during my second deployment," Daniel answered smoothly. "I completed rehabilitation, trained extensively, and I've worked security positions since. My injury doesn't affect my ability to do the job." Kessler pressed his lips into a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That's admirable, really. But we need someone who can handle the full physical demands of the job. Long hours, quick response times, high-risk situations. You understand?" Daniel's stomach coiled in frustration. He had led men through war zones, carried wounded brothers on his back, survived firefights that would make most of these men wet themselves. And now, he was being told he wasn't physically capable of a corporate security position? "With all due respect, sir," Daniel said, keeping his voice steady. "I've handled security operations under conditions far more intense than anything this job requires. My experience speaks for itself." Kessler sighed, setting the resume down and folding his hands on the desk. "Look, I appreciate your service, I do. But this job is competitive and we have to be realistic. We need someone who's..." His eyes flicked again to Daniel's prosthetic, just for a second. "Fully capable." There it was, a polite rejection disguised as corporate necessity. Daniel clenched his jaw, inhaled through his nose, and forced himself to nod. "I understand." He stood, extended his hand, and gave Kessler a firm handshake, stronger than before. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Kessler." Kessler barely met his eye. "Best of luck, Mr. Foster." Daniel turned and walked out, his fists curling inside his pockets. He kept his face neutral until the elevator doors slid shut. Then, alone in the mirrored steel walls, he exhaled slowly, his pulse pounding in his ears. Not good enough. That's what they saw when they looked at him. Not a leader, not a soldier, not a man who had once stood between his country and its enemies. Just a liability. But what Kessler didn't know was that Daniel Foster wasn't the kind of man to accept defeat. 2 weeks passed, 2 weeks of radio silence. Then, one night, Daniel sat in the dim glow of the library's public computers, scrolling through job postings, when something made his blood run cold. Greystone Industries had reposted the exact same job. But this time, hidden at the bottom of the listing were the words, "Applicants must be in full physical condition with no disabilities that could affect performance." They hadn't just rejected him. They had made it policy. Daniel's stomach twisted with rage. He could have walked away, could have let it go. But Daniel Foster had never backed down from a fight. His fingers hovered over his phone screen before he pressed a contact. The line rang twice before a deep voice answered. "Foster? Long time?" "Mark," Daniel said, his voice deadly calm. "I need a favor." Mark Stevenson, former Green Beret, now CEO of Stevenson Security, one of the biggest private security firms in the country, had never been one to let injustice slide. Daniel told him everything. Mark let out a low whistle. "They really put that in the job listing?" "Yeah." A pause, then a dark chuckle. "Well then," Mark said, "let's burn them to the ground." The next morning, the war began. The morning after Daniel's call, Mark Stevenson went to work. He wasn't just a successful businessman. He was a man who knew how to hit where it hurt. Within hours, he had forwarded Greystone's discriminatory job listing to one of the most influential reporters in corporate accountability. By the end of the week, the article dropped. The headline alone sent shockwaves through social media. Greystone Industries accused of discriminating against disabled veterans. Insider emails leak damning evidence. The leaked internal emails revealed the truth. Richard Kessler had not only rejected Daniel, but had given explicit instructions to avoid hiring veterans with disabilities. The backlash was swift and brutal. Social media exploded. Thousands of veterans and military families boycotted Greystone. Sponsors and investors backed out. Within days, Greystone's stock plummeted. Employees started resigning, unwilling to work for a company drowning in scandal. Kessler tried to go into damage control, releasing a half-hearted apology, but the damage was irreversible. As Greystone crumbled, Mark and Daniel launched the final blow, an official Stevenson Security hiring initiative for veterans who had been discriminated against. The press conference went viral. Standing beside Mark, Daniel stepped up to the podium and addressed millions watching online. "I was told I wasn't fully capable, that I wasn't good enough. Well, I'm here to tell every veteran out there, we are more than capable, and we are done being ignored." The speech spread like wildfire. Greystone collapsed within a month. Their biggest clients walked away, their headquarters was put up for sale, and Richard Kessler was forced to resign in disgrace. Weeks later, Stevenson Security bought out Greystone's former offices. On the first day of business under new ownership, Daniel Foster walked through the same front doors he had once been rejected from. Only this time, he wasn't an applicant. He was one of the company's new senior executives. His first order of business? Erase every last trace of Kessler's leadership. At his first team meeting, standing in the same conference room where he had been dismissed, Daniel smirked as he addressed the staff. "Funny thing, I came here looking for a job. Now, I'm running the place." The room erupted in cheers. Daniel Foster had won, and this time, nobody could deny it. A month later, Daniel's assistant knocked on his office door. "Sir," she said, barely holding back a smirk, "Richard Kessler is here." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What does he want?" She hesitated. "A job." For a moment, Daniel considered it. He could humiliate Kessler, make him feel what it was like to be turned away. Instead, he simply leaned back in his chair. "Tell him we don't hire cowards." As the door clicked shut, Daniel stared out at the city skyline. He had won, and this time he was in control.